first, these were Christian secular Palestinians who created the Palestinian resistance movement. It was not Muslims and it was not political Islam. The Palestinian resort to armed struggle is not because the Palestinians are anti-Semitic, because they want to kill Jews or they don't like Jews. It was forced upon them because the Zionist movement came from Europe as a settler movement and took by force their homeland. And not only did it take the land, it began to kick them out of the land. It began in the 1920s, and then came the big expulsion in 1948. And the expulsion continued in 67, and since 67. And as we know, until the 7th of October, and after the 7th of October, Israel still expels Palestinians, both from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is the context. The context is that the Palestinians react to violence. They don't initiate the violence. So the source of violence is the Zionist ideology. We don't justify everything the Hamas did. I mean, the Hamas did things it should not have done on the 7th of October. Raping women is not part of your right for self-defense. There are things that were done that I think are against Islam as well. And that's a pity. I know where it comes from. You cage people for 17 years, you bomb them from the air, and they get out. Things can get out of hand.
Hello, Professor Pappe. I'm happy to host you in this session, and I hope we have a good conversation today.
I'm very happy to be on your show.
Thank you. After the event of the 7th of October, the conflict between Israel and Palestine again erupted in the Iranian society. It has raised many questions. But before we go to that, I want to ask you to speak about your personal journey, which made you to change sides against Israel, and to speak a little about the New Historians movement and its achievements and stuff like that. I'm hearing you.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, my own personal journey, then maybe I will say something about the New Historians. When you are developing a different, the ones that you are taught in school or in the university, and you hear, it's a journey. It doesn't happen in one day. It's a journey that has many stations. And there's one particular moment where you suddenly realize that you don't share the views of your society, you don't share the views of your government, in fact, that you have real issue with not just the policy of the state, but also with the identity of the state and its ideology. And that doesn't happen in a day because you grow up into that ideology, so you need to liberate yourself from this. I think for me, the journey began in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, which I and quite a few friends of mine, we saw as an unnecessary war, not a justified one. And that happened at the time that I was already a PhD student in Oxford, in Britain, and working on the archives in 1948. And I saw the resemblance between what happened in 48 and 1982. And since then, I became both an activist and a professional historian. And what I found in the archives taught me a lot about the past that I didn't know, and I think most Israeli Jews didn't know or deny. And what I found as an activist showed me that many of the things that I found in the past were still happening in the present. And that led me to go even deeper to what is Zionism, what is Zionist ideology, what are the relationship between Jews and Palestinians, and what is the future, to my mind, of Jews and Palestinians in historical Palestine. So that was a long journey, and it included both research and activism. For a moment in the 1990s, I was not alone. We were a group of Israeli historians known as the New Historians who went to the archives and, like me, found that actually the documents show us that in 1948, things happened not the way that we were taught in school or being told by our own historians. So they called us the new historians because we accepted many chapters in the Palestinian version, and mainly in the most important, of course, things that we found out is that the Palestinians became refugees not because of the war, but because they were ethnically cleansed from Palestine by the Zionist army and leaders, and it was an intentional ethnic cleansing. And that, of course, changes your whole perspective on why there are refugees, why there is a Palestinian resistance, and it also impacts your ideas on the solution. But most of the new historians after 2000 retracted and went back to support the official Israeli narrative that actually Israel had to defend itself and the Palestinians were left because the Arab armies told them to leave. And so not much has been left of the new historians. And that's, I think, why they didn't have any influence on Israel. They had influence on academic world outside of Israel. I think where the work of the new historians changed the way Palestine is being researched and taught in Western universities. So in that respect, we had an impact, but not on the Israeli Jewish society.
Okay, let's go to the 7th of October. First of all, I want to ask about the one-state solution. You're the supporter of the one-state solution. Basically, the one-state solution wants to dismantle the apartheid, and its goal is not to kill Israelis. However, for some pro-Palestinians, especially inside Iran, they think that they are the people who are going to emancipate the Palestine, etc. Every Israeli is a legitimate object to be eliminated, which is a anti-Semite view. Although military action is reasonable against military objects, I believe the consequences of the 7th of October will never end. Israel will always refer to it to justify its massacre and to justify its oppression. So, the first question. Is it reasonable to consider Israeli settlers as military objects? Because especially in Iran, some politicians, our current and former foreign minister, said that there are no non-military citizens in Israel. All of them are military objects, and it's legitimate to eliminate them. And the second question, does the military solution help the one-state liberation vision, and how is this possible? Because it just helps the radical view in the Israel, and helps Israel to justify its oppression, its war and siege on Gaza, etc.
So first of all, I think there is a confusion when people talk about settlers. The Palestinian resistance see the settlers, a particular group of settlers, those who settled in the West Bank and who carry guns and are involved in harassing the Palestinian population, in trying to force it to leave, destroying its fields, its businesses, setting fire to its olive groves as part of their military oppression, and therefore part of the Palestinian right to defend itself is to fight against anyone who oppresses you with the power of violence. So you use violence against violence. Of course, this is not a solution to anything, and I think that's why I don't think a military struggle helps the one-state solution, but it's not the main object of the military struggle. I think the main object of the military struggle is to survive, to exist. Palestinians are, if you look at the history of the Palestinian, it's a very peaceful nation. Many of them were farmers, pastoral people, and in fact, they were forced to use force or an armed struggle, because if they hadn't used armed struggle, they would become refugees outside their own homeland. So I don't think the armed struggle is part of the struggle for one state. I think it's a struggle for survival. And I think in that respect, that's the context also, in even the Secretary General of the United Nations said it. This is the context for what the Hamas also did, that you use power, and in this case, some quite brutal power, because you feel you have no other option. It's not as if other options were not attempted by the Palestinians to change the reality of colonization, occupation, and siege. The Palestinians were involved in endless attempts to reach an understanding with the Israelis, but they were always confronted with an Israeli demand that the Palestinians would acknowledge that the whole of Palestine belongs to the Jewish national movement, to Zionism, and that all they can hope for is to live in small ghettos as the best solution for the future. And even that was not kept by the Israelis, because, as I said, the settler movement in the West Bank always wants more territory and less Palestinians in it. So I think that's the context for the violence, if you want, that the Palestinians are using. I don't think that this was the main strategy. If you look at the strategy of the Palestinians since 1975, when they went to the United Nations and they expected the United Nations to help them to dismantle Israeli apartheid, to decolonize Palestine. And in fact, most of the member states of the United Nations in 1975 supported the United Nations General Assembly resolution that Zionism equates racism and apartheid. But under American pressure in 1991, the United Nations retracted from that position. So the sense among the Palestinians is that the world doesn't care if Israel continues its policies of elimination, ethnic cleansing, and colonization.
How about the military solution to help to a liberation vision? I mean, 7th of October was not just a matter of defending itself. Hamas started the war, and we are now seeing that Gaza is completely ruined right now, and maybe after 7th of October, the dream of one-state solution is impossible, I think. What's your idea about this?
I don't think, what is so, in many ways, sad about everything that happens on the 7th of October and after the 7th of October until today, which caused the life of so many people, first of all, young Israeli citizens who were killed, and then even more horrific and more genocidal, more than 11,000 Palestinians and 4,000 Palestinian children. And I think now every 10 minutes, according to the United Nations, a Palestinian child is being killed by Israeli forces, not to mention the total destruction of the Gaza Strip. What is so horrific about this whole event that it doesn't change anything. Namely, what do I mean by that? However this will end, Israel would still occupy the West Bank. Israel would still treat its Palestinian citizens inside Israel like an apartheid state. The Gaza Strip, whatever Israel would do with the Gaza Strip, it will continue to be either under occupation or under siege. It will not be an independent Gaza state. The Palestinian refugees would still remain refugees. Several countries in the Arab world will continue to seek normalization with Israel. The Western government will continue to support Israel, and the Western societies will continue to show solidarity with the Palestinian people. So in that respect, it doesn't change much first of all, the need for a one-state solution. It doesn't change the need for the one-state solution. And secondly, it remains, or it retains rather, the one-state solution as the only way forward, as one of two alternatives. There are only two options here. There are not three options. One option is to go towards a solution of equality, democracy, with everyone between the river and the sea having the same rights, no discrimination on the basis of religion, culture, nationalism, whatever. And of course, correcting many of the evils that were done in the past, returning properties, land, distributing again more fairly the resources and allowing the refugees to return. Now, this is one option. If this option is not accepted, the other option is what we used to call during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, we used to call it MAD. MAD meant mutual assured destruction. Mutual assured destruction. Namely, if you don't go towards a one state, you will continue one cycle of bloodshed after the other. And we already saw in this event, and also before, that there's always a danger, even if nobody wants it, there's always a danger that the Palestine-Israel clash will become a regional war. And when it becomes a regional war, there is more destruction, not only in Israel and Palestine, but in other places as well. And we know there are many people in the West who want to interfere militarily and so on. So it's always very dangerous unless you are involved in a process of reconciliation and decolonization. You are involved in a process of a conflict that every now and then can blow out of proportion and affect the whole region and maybe even beyond the region. Because as you know, there are nuclear weapons involved in it, there are superpowers involved in it, so it never remains in the Middle East. It's not. I think, totally hypothetical to say that if this conflict continues, it is always a danger in turning it into a third world war. And I think that's why it's so important to solve it. And it's a human solution, you know? You say everybody who lives there should be equal. Everybody who was expelled from there should have the right to return. It won't be easy. It's not a good marriage. It's not a happy marriage. People were hating each other for 100 years. It will take time to build something together. But believe me, I don't see any other option. Really, I don't see any other option.
Regarding the one-state solution, I want to quote Noah Harari here. He's on the camp that thinks one-state solution is utopic and impossible. I quote him. I was just reading him today. He said that peace between Israel and Palestine doesn't need historical justice. It needs some kind of compromisation. We have to suspend these historical conflicts for a moment. We have to forget about the historical justice, and that's when we can think to peace between Palestine and Israel. So I want to ask about this matter. What are the realistic solutions right now to solve this problem? I mean, I agree with you that one-state solution is the only solution that will solve the problem in long term. But what's the realistic solution on the ground right now?
Yeah, first of all, it's always the occupier and the colonizer who says, let's forget about history. And in this particular case, this particular colonizer took Palestine over in the name of history. So, I mean, this is really ridiculous to to say that you should forget about historical justice when the whole idea of Zionism is based on making a just solution for a problem that occurred 2,000 years ago. Of course, the Palestinians would insist on historical justice, and rightly so, especially because the injustice of 48 continues today. So that's first of all. So there's no way of having a compromise that dehistoricizes the conflict. That never will happen. That will never work. And that's the main problem with the two-state solution. What to do now? I think to do now, we have now an issue that calls for a way of asking, do we continue with revenge? Because Israel is now revenge. The Palestinians would revenge their revenge. And this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Unless the outside world, not Israel, Israel will never do it. Unless the region, the Arab world, the Muslim world, the global south, because I don't expect much of the global north. The global south would say, wait a minute, we are now taking over from the Americans, their intervention in this story. And we have the power, the economic power, the political power, the cultural power to pressure Israel to go into meaningful negotiations with the Palestinians, at least to start with 3 basic rights, even before you talk about one-state solution. How to end a very ruthless military occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank, how to end the discrimination against the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and how to end the siege on Gaza and offer the people of Gaza an organic connection to the West Bank at least, a normal life without siege and so on. But before that happens, you have to rebuild now the Gaza Strip. You have to rebuild it. And this is a long process that you have to force Israel to go into it because they would never do it themselves. Now, this reminds me of South Africa. Apartheid South Africa did not wish to go into negotiations with the African majority, but it was forced through sanctions to do that. And only that kind of pressure would ensure 2 things. One, that maybe there is a way out of it without violence, because sanctions are not violent. And maybe this will open the way for a more reasonable, comprehensive solution that, we now say all the Israeli Jews are against it, but they might see it differently because it's difficult for them to give up their privileges. But, I visited South Africa in 2014 and every white person told me that he was against apartheid. I said, if you were all against apartheid, why did it continue for so long? Things can change, but it has to be regional, international pressure, because what the Palestinians want is basic human rights and civil rights. Israel always presents them as people who wants to kill, to push the Jews to the sea, to impose theocracy, and this is all not true. The basic Palestinian impulse is to have normal life. And they should be entitled to have it.
I want to go to the Iran and Israel matter now.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, the Arab world is right now normalizing its relations with Israel. The West is supporting Israel. And in this situation, Iran is the only country as the core of the so-called axis of resistance that is supporting Palestine and the one-state solution somehow. So I want to ask you that what will happen if somehow Iran stopped to support Palestine? I mean, most of the forces, the opposition forces inside Iran, are right-wing and they do not support Palestine. In this matter, how do you see the balance of forces in the region, in the Middle East, and the role of Iran in this conflict between Palestine and Israel?
First of all, I think that what is important is not so much the Iranian military support. I don't think it, if I look at it as an historian, it doesn't change the balance of power. Israel is too powerful. And again, I don't think you'll defeat ever Israel militarily. If someone thinks that Palestine would be liberated by force, he is mistaken. Nobody has the power to liberate Palestine by military force. Nobody, not even Iran. Palestine would be liberated if the international community would show the same solidarity with the Palestinians as it has shown with the African National Congress in apartheid South Africa. That's my first point. The second point is that if Iran stops military support, the question is, will it stop diplomatic support for the Palestinians, political support for the Palestinians? This is, for me, much more important, a strong Iranian support for the right of the Palestinians for liberation rather than a military support, which I don't think helps much, and I think it complicates things rather than helping. And there is, of course, the issue, as you know, there's also issues of human rights and civil rights in Iran itself that have to be resolved in order to make Iran even more significant as a power for change in Palestine. But potentially, it would be a disaster if Iran would, let's say, adopt the Saudi or the Egyptian position on Palestine. That would be a big blow for the chances of liberation. So I hope it doesn't happen. But I'm not sure that the current strategy that Iran is using is the right one. And as I say, I think there are also domestic issues in Iran that have to be. So anyone in the opposition in Iran who thinks that the problem is the support of the Palestinian, I think should think in a different way. I understand what their agenda is, but they should think that the problem is that nobody is even talking about issues not only in Iran, all over the Arab world, in fact, not just in the Arab world, in the world as a whole. Countries have issues of civil rights and human rights. They are different in different countries, but governments always have the power over people, and they're not always respecting people's rights because they have so much power. States have a lot of power, right? But you don't have a good discussion, especially in our part of the world, in the Middle East, about rights if one country is excluded from this conversation, Israel. In fact, I would say that if you want to have a proper conversation of human rights and civil rights in Iran, you have to have a proper conversation on the violation of human rights and civil rights of the Palestinians. I don't think you can dissociate that. I think one of the reasons it's difficult to talk in the Middle East as a whole about human rights and civil rights is because Israel always enjoyed this status of, we can violate human rights, civil rights, because we are part of the West. We are part of the civilized world. So we are not part of this discussion. So I think that's the connection. And I think, as we said before, I think the Palestinians are facing a real destruction. So I'm not surprised that people want to have them also with military power. I understand it. But I'm just saying that I think that this is a matter of maybe helping the Palestinians to survive. It's not the means that would solve the issue in a final way.
Now I want to talk about specifically about Hamas. As you know, actually, there is a logic spreading in Iran that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They look at Israel in a way that because it's fighting with an Islamist movement, which is Hamas, and Iran, as the same as Hamas, is an Islamist government. So if we fight in Iran, the public opinion, if it disagrees with Hamas. So it's somehow empowering democracy and supporting democracy in Iran. What do you have to say to this fraction of people in Iran? I mean, does Israel represent some kind of democracy and such things in the Middle East?
Yeah, first of all, I never liked the idea the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You should support someone because you believe in him, not because he's the enemy of your enemy. I mean, that is never working too well. Even during the mandatory period in Palestine, some of the Zionist organization, when they realized that Germany, Nazi Germany, was the enemy of Britain, but they also regarded Britain the enemy of Zionism, they said, well, the enemy of my enemy is Nazi Germany, so maybe we should even think of aligning ourselves with them. But of course, the moment they realized that the Nazis are exterminating the Jews in Europe, they stopped it. So you always run into these issues. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work. It works in Hollywood films among criminals, but I don't think it works among moral people or movement of change of human rights and civil rights. That's my first point. The second point is that I think there is a mistake here in conflicting the two issues, namely the issue of what is the future of Iran, what is the nature of the Iranian state. It's a complicated history that begins with a revolution against a very oppressive Shah regime, developing into something that I understand people in Iran who are not happy, maybe not with everything, but maybe part of it. So that's an Iranian issue. And as I said, the part of the human rights and civil rights, if you want the international community to interfere in this and to be constructive in this, you have to interfere in Israel as well. That's my first point. The second point, I think Hamas is different. It's a different story. It's not. It did not come over as a revolution against an oppressive Shah. It is the Palestinian Liberation Movement, which is an anti-colonialist movement, has started to work already in the 1920s. It's already 104 or 105 years old, this movement. And the movement always had a political Islamic wing, a secular wing, and a very leftist wing. Usually they knew how to work together, by the way. It is only after Oslo that these became different Palestinian movements, sometimes unfortunately also fighting each other, not just fighting Israel. So you can support change in Iran, but if you support it in the name of human rights and civil rights, you have to support the Palestinians and see that the Hamas is part of that movement against the destruction of the Palestinians and the violation of Palestinian rights. That's the second point. The third point, Israel is definitely not a democracy. It's democracy for Jews, absolutely. As a Jewish citizen, I can tell you, I enjoy democracy. But everyone who's a Palestinian, citizen, under occupation, under siege, or as refugees, don't have the rights. So if half of the population doesn't have the rights of democracy, it's not a democracy. It's not a democracy. And there's something people tend to forget. You know, there was an interesting interview with the Palestinian Prime Minister in Gaza, Akram Haniyeh. Was it with Haniyeh? I think it was with Haniyeh. Maybe one of the leaders of Hamas. I'm sorry, I don't forget exactly with who it was. But one of the leaders of Hamas, who is in Qatar, was interviewed, and they said one reporter, Palestinian reporter, asked him, "You know, I don't like the idea that if you take over, Palestine will be an Islamic theocracy if we win." And he answered a very interesting question. He said, "You know, we are not at all discussing the day after liberation." He said, "I won't be here after liberation. I am now asking, how do we do liberation, not what do we do after liberation. So I think the main support for the Palestinians now, as I said before, is to try and prevent the destruction of the Palestinians and help them with the liberation project. How exactly Palestine would look after liberation is up to the Palestinians, and they would also negotiate, I think, this with the Jews in Palestine eventually. But we are not there yet. We are at the stage where we have, particularly now, we have an Israeli government that even openly talks about destroying the Palestinians. Until now, they didn't always talk about it. So now we are all in the business of trying to save the Palestinians. What will become later is up to the Palestinians and those they would choose as their partners about the future.
From an Iranian viewpoint, I'm going to ask this. Iranians have the experience of such propositions. We have to make a coalition, and after the revolution, after the elimination of the apartheid, then we will decide who will rule. This experience somehow, Iranians are skeptical of this politics. They think that an Islamist movement, Islamist group, cannot emancipate the people of Palestine because they see that somehow they haven't experienced the same inside their own country. You know what I'm saying? How can we visualize that day after the apartheid that Hamas or any other Islamist group is going to bring democracy to Palestine?
Yeah, well, I think that you're right. Iranians, and not only in Iran, some of the revolutions in the Arab world had the other experience when the more secular military forces arrested the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and did not allow them any share in the government, despite the fact that they helped them to decolonize Egypt. So yes, there is a bad experience all over the Middle East, but that's what's so peculiar about Palestine. Palestine is the only country that has not been yet liberated in the Middle East. So we can learn from all the mistakes that were done in the past, and hopefully build something better, including what kind of rules of the game will be there after liberation, how to ensure that the liberation is not a post-colonial disaster, as happened in some countries in Africa and Asia. We have to work on this. You know, even South Africa is not a good story now. Economically, apartheid is not a very post-apartheid South Africa is not a great success story. So also economically, we have to think of how to make sure that it's still a very egalitarian society, not just the rich and poor after liberation. It's not just about religion and secularism. There are many other issues. I think that, you know, I belong to a movement called the One Democratic State Initiatives, and we look at the history of the Middle East before the arrival of imperialism until 1918. And communities knew how to live. There was a genuine coexistence between people who were very religious, people who were less religious, people who were Christians, people who were Jews, people who were Muslims. We have to rebuild the mosaic that was there before. We have to question also the idea of the nation state, but this will take time. This will take time. Because you don't want even to have someone with such power to say, my ideology, you know, erases all other ideologies. We want the state to be much more neutral in its relationship with people's moral values and value systems. But Palestine can still do it because it's not a state yet. It has a chance to try and show something different. Because it doesn't even matter whether it's a good idea or bad idea. That's the only thing we can do. We can only do. We should hope that we will be successful. I don't talk about myself, that the generations after us will be successful in doing it. We can leave them a legacy that's saying, study the history of post-revolutionary Iran, study the history of post-colonial Africa, study the history of post-liberation Egypt and Syria or Lebanon. Learn from the mistakes. Take what positives you can from that. Try and preempt the problems. But that doesn't mean that now you don't need a wide coalition in order to save the Palestinians.
Now I want to ask a question about the activism for Palestine inside Iran. As you're aware, the problem of Palestine is somehow gone to the state. I mean, people of Iran, Palestine is not problematized for people of Iran. In this situation, how can we problematize Palestine again and connect this activism inside Iran to the global activism for Palestine? You support BDS, for example. BDS is meaningless inside Iran. What can you sanction inside Iran? I mean, what's your idea about the activism, social activism inside Iran?
Yes, I think that people should be able to, first of all, have activism for problems which are not only their own problem. Because the world is, as someone used to say, the world is a global village. And the problem, everybody thinks that their own problems are unique and exceptional, and nobody else has these problems. I think people who are minorities, people who feel that their basic rights are violated, should always look for a wide coalition with other people who feel the same and show solidarity with them. If you feel that your human rights and civil rights are violated, and you think it's better to go along with Israel and America in the fight for your democratic rights, you are not seeking the right allies. Because America and Israel are not interested in your rights. They're interested in their own regional interests. But if you talk to African Americans in America, to Latin Americans, to Native Americans, to the Zapatista in Mexico, to the First Nations in Australia, to the Palestinians, if you talk to people or to the Muslims in Kashmir, if you talk to people who are suffering from oppression and are fighting, as I say, they're fighting for normal life, then your alliances are much better, are much stronger, and you don't make the mistake of undermining your own cause by choosing the wrong allies. So I think that any fight, whether it's in Iran or in Israel or in Palestine, for human rights. This is for me the most important thing, human rights and civil rights. If these fights are your moral compass, then you cannot talk about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You have to support the fight of everyone else. Otherwise, people will not support your fight. People will not support your fight. And secondly, we live in the Middle East, and we know that when we talk about Islam, religion, tradition, secularism, they are not the same ideas as the European ones. There's a different kind of relationship in the Arab world, in the Middle East as a whole, between tradition, civilization, religion, freedoms, rights, and there are a delicate balance between all of them that were actually quite well maintained until the creation of the nation state by the colonialist powers, Britain and France. And I think, as I said before, I think there is a model there that has to be adapted to the 21st century, by which if you oppose, let's say, an Islamist regime, it doesn't mean that you oppose Islam. It doesn't mean that you underestimate what tradition and religion means for people. And you don't take this kind of secular Western attitude that this is primitive, this belongs to the past, it doesn't have any meaning in the present, in the future. It's, in one of my articles, I called it the dialogical state. You have to be all the time in a dialogue in such a situation. You don't always solve everything, but at least you agree on having the dialogue rather than trying to defeat the others. That is not easy to do in a society. But as I say, history shows us that it was possible. The great Indian philosopher, Gayatri Spivak, called it conflictual coexistence. It's a conflictual coexistence, which means I may be a secular leftist and not a religious person, and I would still regard you as part of my society, and I would still want to be with you in the same state, even if we may have a different perspective on religion. Because I believe in a dialogue that is beneficial to both of us. But if we both believe, no, I have to either convert you or you have to convert me, and I have to oppress you to accept my position, then there's no basis for a common community.
As the last question, I want to go back to the historical context which you spoke about, that the event of 7th of October happened within it. First of all, I want to ask you about that historical context. I mean, maybe we say that there is a state of Israel, which is attacked by a military group, and it wants to defend itself. How can you morally criticize this defense from a historical point of view, as you referred to it several times? I want to elaborate a little bit on this historical context which justifies the attack of Hamas.
Now, we have to be careful when we say we justify. We don't justify everything that Hamas did. I mean, Hamas did things it should not have done on the 7th of October. Raping women is not part of your right for self-defense. The things that were done that I think are against Islam as well, as far as I understand Islam. And that's a pity. I know where it comes from. You cage people for 17 years, you bomb them from the air, and they get out. Things can get out of hand, and that's a pity. So I'm to be very careful when you say we justify. I don't justify these acts. No, I don't. But I understand the Palestinian need to protect themselves. So first of all, not only Israel has the right to defend itself, also the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. But when I say historical context, I claim that in most cases, and this includes the operation in Gaza today, in most cases, when Israel claimed that what it does is to defend itself, it was not an action of defense. It was action of aggression, of ethnic cleansing, of occupation. The pretext was to defend itself. Let me give you an example. Even if you look at the 7th of October, pushing the Hamas outside of the area it occupied of Israel is self-defense. Destroying Gaza is not self-defense. There's a difference. There's a difference. And the international law is very clear. It says self-defense does not allow you to violate international law. But historically, what we meant by the historical context is that the Palestinian, we talked about it before, the Palestinians' decision eventually to go to an armed struggle. By the way, at first these were Christian secular Palestinians who created the Palestinian resistance movement. It was not Muslims and it was not political Islam. The Palestinian resort to armed struggle is not because the Palestinians are anti-Semitic, because they want to kill Jews or they don't like Jews. It was forced upon them because the Zionist movement came from Europe as a settler movement and took by force their homeland. And not only did it take the land, it began to kick them out of the land. It began in the 1920s, and then came the big expulsion in 1948. And the expulsion continued in 67, and since 67. And as we know, until the 7th of October, and after the 7th of October, Israel still expels Palestinians, both from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is the context. The context is that the Palestinians react to violence. They don't initiate the violence. So the source of violence is the Zionist ideology and the Israeli understanding that historical Palestine belongs to them and they want the land without the people. By the way, this is not unique to Zionism. All the European settler movements did the same. They just did it 200 years before. The white settlers genocided the Native Americans. The Australians genocided the Australians and the Native Australians, and so on and so forth. So what we are talking here is not self-defense, but rather using the pretext of self-defense to complete the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And this is why I oppose it. Not that I deny the right of people to defend themselves. But when the self-defense is used to perpetrate genocide and ethnic cleansing, then it's not self-defense. Then it becomes war crimes.
I'm also curious to know about your prediction of the end of the war and what will happen in the region in the next few weeks or months. Or I don't know how much will it take to end the war, but I'm curious to know about your idea, your prediction of the end of this war, and will 7th of October be a turning point in the history of Palestine or not?
First of all, no, it's not going to be a turning point. Unfortunately, and I said it before, it's not. Now, I don't know exactly what will happen. I think the military operation of Israel will continue for a few weeks. The big question is, and I don't have an answer, will it deteriorate to a more regional war? I don't know. Will the Western public opinion succeed in pressuring the United States in particular to try and pressure Israel to put a stop to the military operation? Will the Hamas survive as a guerrilla movement inside Gaza, or will it be really militarily destroyed? Will Israel begin pushing the refugees into Egypt? Will Egypt agree to accept the refugees? Nobody, I tell you the truth, the people themselves who has to make the decision haven't decided yet. That's why you and I don't know, because they don't know yet. I don't think Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon knows exactly still how he will interfere, if at all. I don't think the Israelis know exactly yet what they want to do when they occupy the whole of the Gaza Strip, and they will feel that, at least militarily, they have defeated the Hamas. I don't think they know themselves. And I don't think the Americans yet know when and how to interfere. So we have to wait. But unfortunately, if we don't have at least a ceasefire, a long ceasefire, waiting meaning more suffering for the Palestinian people. And that's why at least we should hope that there will be an international consensus about the ceasefire, even if there's no consensus about the day after.
Thank you very much, Professor Pappe. I enjoyed talking with you, and
thank you.
I thank your
Same here.
answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Thank you.
good day.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.